The Three Princes Meet the Black Robber. Centuries ago, the ancient kingdom of Vidarbha was ruled by a king who had 3 sons. When his wife died, the king married again, and the second queen also had a son. As the years went by, the queen became more and more embittered at the thought that her 3 stepsons had prior claim to the throne, so there was little possibility of her own son ever becoming the monarch. One evening, the queen confided her troubles to her old nurse, who had a reputation for dabbling in the murky depths of witchcraft. "To your majesty, nothing is impossible," advised the old nurse. "With a little imagination, you can see that your son succeeds to the throne." "How can that be possible, whilst my stepsons are alive?" asked the queen. "Listen carefully," confided the old nurse. "Let your son invite his half-brothers to a game of dice, and I will provide your son with a set of magic dice so he cannot lose." "But what will the stakes be?" queried the queen. "That is simple," chortled the nurse. "The losers must carry out any wish of the winner. So your son can command them to fetch him the 3 magic horses owned by King Somadev, and like everyone else who has tried, they will most certainly be caught and executed." The queen thought this was a beautiful scheme, and no time was lost in arranging the game of dice. Thanks to the magic dice, the queen's son won easily, and the 3 princely brothers were promptly commanded to steal the magic horses belonging to King Somadev. The 3 princes were aghast at such a formidable task, because it was well known throughout the entire land that King Somadev showed no mercy to anyone who even touched his horses. Without a word of protest, the 3 princes agreed to this mad scheme. They rode off early one morning to Somadev's kingdom. As they neared their destination, they suddenly found their road barred by a solitary horseman, dressed from head to foot in black. "Halt," he commanded. "Who are you? And where are you going?" "We are princes of Vidarbha," replied one of the princes, spurring his horse forward. "And if you must know, we plan to steal King Somadev's magic horses." The man in black burst out laughing. "I admire your audacity, although like you, it may be short-lived. I am the notorious black robber, and for the fun of it, I will at least help you to get into King Somadev's stables." Late that night, the 3 princes and the black robber scaled the palace walls. The black robber, who seemed to know his way around, led them silently to the stables. Making sure that no guards were in sight, they opened the stable doors, but as they slipped inside, the horses neighed loudly. Before they could find a place to hide, they were roughly overpowered by grooms and the guard, and unceremoniously thrown into a dungeon. The following morning, the 4 prisoners, heavily guarded, were taken into a large, cavernous chamber, and standing along the far wall were 4 great cauldrons with fires beneath, and from the acrid smell, these huge pots contained boiling oil. Then into the chamber strode the king, obviously in no merciful mood. Glancing at the prisoners, he suddenly stopped and peered at the black robber. "So, we have caught you at last," he exclaimed. "But who are your 3 accomplices?" "These 3 young men are my companions," replied the black robber, "and they are princes of Vidarbha." "Princes or no princes, for daring to steal my horses, the penalty is death," roared the king, and pointing to the black robber, he went on. "Do these princes realize how close to death they are?" "Your Majesty," returned the black robber, "these princes are no nearer to death than I was some time ago, yet here I am still alive." "Not for long, you villain," chortled the king, "but tell me how you escaped death, and if your story pleases me, I will let the youngest prince go free." And so the black robber told his story. Once there were 3 beautiful princesses who had a curse put on them, so that at night they turned into horrible witches. Now these 3 witches put a curse on me and made me turn to robbing for a living. But one night I resolved to find out more about the witches, and when I searched through the forest, I discovered them in a cave, sitting around a huge cauldron cooking their food. I took up a large boulder and threw it at the cauldron. The cauldron burst into hundreds of pieces, splattering boiling food everywhere. I ran for my life, but the witches could run faster, and in the end, I had to take refuge in a tall tree. But the witches were not to be done out of their prey. The first witch turned one of the other witches into a big axe, the other into a ferocious hound, and started to chop down the tree. After only 2 strokes, the tree began to topple, and I realized that death was very near. Just then, a cock began to crow, and the 3 witches turned back into princesses and walked away, hand in hand, chattering gaily to each other. "That certainly was a narrow escape," said the king. "So I will set the youngest prince free, but now the other 2 are closer to death than you have ever been." "Not so, your majesty," said the black robber. "A short time ago I was closer to death than they are." "Well, let us hear this story," said the king, "and providing it sounds good, I will set one of the other princes free." This is the story the black robber recounted. "Last month I stole 2 fat cows from a farmstead. Driving them home through a deep wood, I suddenly felt tired, so I tied the 2 cows to trees and laid down to rest. I had hardly closed my eyes when 13 tigers came on the scene. Their leader was a huge fellow, who promptly leaped on one of the cows and killed it. After eating some of the animal, he left the rest to the other tigers to enjoy, and attacked the second cow. I lay there petrified, because I knew my turn would be next. Gathering up my courage, I made a dash for the nearest tree, with all the tigers at my heels. But I managed to climb out of harm's way. The angry tigers started to claw the trunk of the tree, ripping the bark and wood to shreds. Soon the tree started to creak and sway. Then hurtling through the forest came 12 roaring lionesses led by a massive lion. Soon there was a tremendous battle royal, and in the end, only the lion was left alive. There stood the lion, covered in blood, glaring at me, when suddenly my tree gave an agonizing screech and crashed to the ground, killing the lion in its fall. So once again, I narrowly escaped death. "Bravo!" exclaimed the king. "That was a miraculous escape, so the second prince is now reprieved. That leaves us with just 1 prince who is now on the verge of death." "But," said the robber with a sigh, "I can recall when I was a lot closer to death than this prince." "What, another story?" roared the king. "Let us hear it. And maybe, if it sounds true, I will let this other prince go free." "At one time," the robber said, "I was so successful in my livelihood, I decided to engage an assistant who had a reputation of being a first-class thief. For our first job together, we agreed to rob a ferocious giant who lived in a cave high in the mountains. When we reached the giant's hideout, we found that the entrance was a hole in the ground, with a sheer drop of about 100 feet to the floor of the cave. Luckily, we had brought a coil of strong rope with us. Lowering the rope, I asked my assistant to go down and collect the booty. He seemed scared, so I went. The cave was full of treasure, and I quickly collected a bag of gold pieces, which I tied to the end of the rope, and shouted to my assistant to haul it up. This he did, but when I called for the rope to be lowered so that I could climb out, my assistant just laughed at me and made off with the gold and the rope. There I was in the cave, with no means of escape, entirely at the mercy of the giant when he returned. After hours of waiting, full of unquieting thoughts as to my impending doom, a rope was lowered and down came the giant. What a hideous monster he was, fully 30 feet tall. I stood in the shadows of the cave, and when the giant's back was turned, I carefully edged my way to the rope and quickly climbed up to freedom. But the giant noticed me out of the corner of his eye and was soon in hot pursuit. I climbed that rope like a monkey, but the giant, with his enormous reach, could climb faster. I was nearing the top, gasping from exertion, when the giant made a grab at me. I was so frightened I let go of the rope and fell on the giant, and the force of my fall caused him to lose his hold on the rope, and we both crashed down into the cave. The giant landed with a crash like thunder, and every bone in his body was broken. Luckily, I landed on top of him, and his huge body acted like a cushion, so I got to my feet unhurt. "After hearing such a story, I shall have to let the other prince go free," said the king, stroking his beard. "Now that only leaves you, so you are now closer to death than you have ever been." "Not so, your majesty," said the robber. I can certainly recall when I was closer to death than now. This had better be good, said the king, if you hope to save your miserable hide. Many years ago, recounted the robber, I was wandering through the forest when I came upon an old woman with a small child in her lap. The old woman had tears streaming down her face, and I noticed she was holding a knife in her hand. When I asked her what was the matter, she poured out a most pitiful story. It appeared that 3 brother giants kidnapped the old woman, who was a nurse, and the child from some palace. The giants had ordered the woman to kill and cook the child for their dinner. I told the woman not to worry, as I would soon find a young pig, which she could cook and the giants would not know the difference. I caught a piglet, which the old woman cooked, and we hid the child in some bushes close to the hut. When the giants returned to the hut and sat down to their dinner, I hid in the kitchen, racking my brains as to how to rid the world of these beasts. To my dismay, one of the giants suddenly walked into the kitchen and grabbed me before I could hide. He threw me across his shoulder, but I managed to draw my dagger and stabbed him repeatedly in the back. One of the other giants, hearing the noise, came rushing into the kitchen, but I was hiding behind the door. Before he could turn, my dagger ended his useless life. The 3rd giant came roaring into the kitchen, brandishing a big club, and when he saw the bodies of his brothers, he let out a terrible oath and threw the club at me. I jumped to one side, and as the giant bent to pick up his club, I jumped on his back and stabbed him through the heart. "It is true! It is true!" shouted the king, jumping out of his chair and embracing the black robber. "I was that child. My parents searched everywhere for you. Now I have found you." King Somadev's joy knew no bounds. He wanted to heap gifts on the black robber and on the princes. Afterwards, it was agreed that the black robber would stay in the king's service. The king bade the princes to take his magic horses, but he added with a sly grin, "Have no fear, they will never stay with strangers and will soon come galloping back home." When the princes returned home with the magic horses, their stepmother hid her chagrin at their safe return. She chattered incessantly about what a great man her son would be with his magic horses. She claimed he would soon be more famous than any king. Alas, when her son went to lead the horses to the stables, they reared up on their hind legs, sending the son headlong, and galloped off back to King Somadev's stables. Thereafter, the queen seemed to lose interest in her son ever acquiring the throne. And so, the 3 princes were left in peace. The end.